Hello, everyone, and welcome to our panel on the US election, co-organized by the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, the UBC Political Science Department, and the Canadian International Council, Vancouver chapter. My name is Easton. I'm a graduate student in the Master of Public Policy and Global Affairs at the SPPGA. I first moved to Canada when I was 19 to start my bachelor's degree, but I grew up and still vote in a swing state, Wisconsin. My vote actually mattered. Like I assume it was for many of you, this was an unusually stressful election. The enormous policy consequences, very high turnout, closer than forecast results, and control of the Senate that still hangs in the balance merely hint at the mountain of information our experts can parse. I'm excited to hear our panel discuss some of these issues. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the ancestral, traditional, and unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples on which Vancouver residents live, work, and study. Additionally, a few quick housekeeping notes for our session today, which you'll see in the chat. Please note that we are recording this session and we'll be posting the video on our website. We are leaving the chat open, and activity in the chat will not be monitored. Will not be recorded. Please direct your questions to our Q&A moderator, Tatiana Parrish, who will either call on you to unmute yourself and state your question, or she can state it on your behalf, depending on what you want to do. Please be mindful and respectful during this session and in the chat. Today's moderator is Dr. Sheryl Lightfoot. Dr. Lightfoot is the Canada Research Chair of Global Indigenous Rights and Politics and an associate professor at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, Political Science, and Indigenous Studies at the University of British Columbia. She also currently serves as senior advisor to the UBC President on Indigenous Affairs, where she was a lead on developing UBC's new Indigenous Strategic Plan. As one of the world's experts in global Indigenous politics, Sheryl's research specializes in complex questions of Indigenous people's rights and how those rights are being claimed and negotiated in various political spaces. Her work explores both practical and theoretical aspects of implementation of Indigenous rights globally, as well as in comparative domestic and regional contexts. She holds a master's degree from Hubert H. Humphrey Institute of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota, with specialties in foreign policy and international affairs, as well as economic and community development. She has 15 years prior volunteer and contract experience with a number of American Indian tribes and community-based organizations in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, including 9 years as chair of the board of American Indian Policy Center, a research and advocacy group. Dr. Lightfoot is Anishinaabe from Lake Superior Band of Ojibwe, enrolled at the Keweenaw Bay community in Northern Michigan. With that, I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Lightfoot to introduce our other panelists.
Thank you very much, Easton, for the introduction and for getting us started. And before I begin, I'd also like to add that October was a busy mail-in balloting month for a number of us who vote in both countries. So not only did we cast a BC ballot in October, but several of us, like Easton, also cast a mail-in ballot in the United States. Mine went to Minnesota, which is less of a swing state than Wisconsin, but was still in play in the conversation in some circles. So hello, neighbor Easton from the neighboring state of Wisconsin. And thanks for starting us off that way this afternoon. So it's my pleasure to serve as the moderator of this discussion today, and I believe this is the last in this series, so I want to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon. And throughout the series, we've been covering a variety of overlapping issues and topics. As we all probably are keenly aware by now, the 2020 presidential election has probably been one of the most bitterly contested and consequential races in a number of years. And some of us remember the contested race of 2000, but I think this one even surpassed some of the drama that we saw at that point. Particularly with the COVID-19 pandemic, it has been quite laid bare, the structural inequalities and the harsh realities that for decades have been faced by many Americans. And persistent racialized violence and police brutality, especially in my home city of Minneapolis, have been met with global protests and widespread calls to dismantle systems of violence and oppression. And if we think back to earlier in the year, we can remember some extreme wildfires that continued through the summer and storms that have provided us with stark reminders of the existential threat of climate change that impacts all of us on this planet. And in addition to the very real moral issues at stake, the country is faced with challenges to the primacy of objective truth and reality, and a rejection of longstanding procedural norms in government's handling of these overlapping crises. This election continues to be, I think, what we could call an ultimate stress test for democratic values, norms, and institutions in the United States. And in the series, we've looked at issues and dynamics that have been driving the campaigns, the legal questions surrounding the process and result, and the election's impact on wider global politics. And today we hope to look at what we can expect as we look ahead into 2021 with dynamics between President-elect Biden, the new Congress, changes in the global trade order, and of course, our continuing fight against COVID-19. It's my pleasure to introduce today's panel of speakers to you. Quite a distinguished panel, I must say. So we will hear today from Paul Quirk, Professor Paul Quirk, who is Phil Lind Chair here at UBC in US Politics and Representation. He has written on a wide range of topics in American politics, including Congress, the presidency, presidential elections, public opinion, regulatory politics, and public policy making. He has published and served on the editorial boards of several major journals. Also today, we have Gyung-Ho Jeong, who's assistant professor in UBC's Department of Political Science. His research interests include US politics, legislative politics, social choice, political economy, and legislative politics in Korea. Dr. Jeong is interested in how Congress makes decisions on public policies, including civil rights, immigration, trade, and foreign policy issues. We also have Kristen Hopewell, who is Associate Professor and Canada Research Chair in Global Policy at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at UBC. Her research specializes in international trade, global governance, industrial policy and development, with a focus on emerging powers. Dr. Hopewell has written 2 books on global economic issues, and her policy writings have been featured in a variety of major magazines and newspapers. And rounding out the panel today is Heidi Tworek, who's Associate Professor of History and Public Policy. And her research brings a historical sensibility to policy discussions, particularly around communications and international organizations. Dr. Tworek has briefed or advised officials and policymakers from multiple European and North American governments on media, democracy, and the digital economy. And she currently co-edits the Journal of Global History and manages the United Nations History Project. Our plan for this afternoon is that I will invite each speaker in turn to offer roughly 5 to 7 minutes of opening remarks with their reaction to the post-election period. And then we will open up to questions and answer sessions for the remainder of the afternoon, which will also include your questions coming forward through the chat and the moderated Q&A to follow. So I would like to turn first this afternoon to Paul Quirk, who will open up with some remarks.
Thank you very much, Sheryl. My specialization, most relevant to this panel, is actually the presidency. And I will be writing quite soon a chapter for a book on the election about the prospects for the Biden presidency. So I will kind of comment fairly generally about that topic, the prospects for the Biden presidency. I should acknowledge that the election is in some respects still in dispute. That is, as Donald Trump and many of his supporters have not conceded that Joe Biden has won the election, and we could talk about the prospects for that challenge. I don't think I'll say much about it, but maybe in the Q&A it will come up much more. It may come up more. It appears, just to state this briefly, it appears that Trump's legal strategies, that is the idea of getting courts to overturn any of these elections, have just about run out, with all of them being defeated ignominiously on the grounds of having no basis in fact. And the administration, Trump appears to be moving on to an even more outlandish strategy, which is to try to convince Republican legislators in the states to overturn the result of the popular election in their states. I don't think this is something that one needs to worry about actually succeeding. One needs to be extremely worried about its implications for American democracy, that such a challenge could actually occur. Just by the way, just today there's a new poll that's asking American citizens, American voters, whether they believe that Trump was, that Biden was elected fairly or not. And the result of this poll is that about close to 90% of people who reported that they voted for Trump say that Biden was not elected fairly. So the effect of this debate in the population is quite significant, but it still does not seem at all likely that Republican legislators are going to go along with that type of plan. So I think we can talk about Biden becoming president and think about what the prospects are for his success. I think that just to state very broadly what I think is the case, the Biden presidency will have a tremendous list of challenges and priority items to try to address and to accomplish policy change on. And I'll mention a bit, I'll go through a list briefly later. But I think just to set the direction here, I would say that he is likely to be successful in a very large number of important things, the way things are set up now, but he's also likely to fall short in a number of important respects. So just to mention some of the things that Biden will be dealing with, he's going to be trying to manage the pandemic, manage an economic recovery, and try to reverse various Trump policies in areas like environment, treatment of refugees, immigration, trade, healthcare, where there has been some considerable erosion of the effectiveness of the Affordable Care Act, that is Obamacare. He'll be trying to renew the traditional U.S. role in the world, strengthening alliances. He will be trying to try to correct an imbalance in the federal courts toward conservative appointments, especially Trump-era appointments. He will have a major agenda, I believe, of restoring and protecting the rule of law, that is, better protecting law enforcement, especially the Justice Department, from politicization, seeking greater independence of federal prosecutors and the inspectors general that enforce standards of that police misbehavior and corruption in the executive agencies. I think there will be a desire to establish a better special counsel law. And one of the most fundamental objectives of the administration will be to try to improve the protection of voting rights and other aspects of the democratic quality of American elections. There would be a strong desire to try to limit partisan redistricting for House of Representative seats. And there are various, in the kind of high-end aspirations of Democrats, there would be a desire to improve the partisan balance of the political system as a whole, where the Senate has been favoring Republicans in recent years in very substantial ways, and the House does as well. So there are all these objectives. It's really an incredible list of important priorities. And what I think is important to recognize is that they encounter very different circumstances. I'll try to go through these just very quickly. There are some cases where the president can act unilaterally, make executive decisions. Trump actually passed very few laws. Most of his policy changes were by executive order. And to a great extent, those can be reversed by other executive orders. In foreign policy, he can change policies that are dominated by the executive as well. Then there's a second category, and I'm going to make two categories. There's one group of matters that would require legislative action, where there is some potential for bipartisan cooperation. That is assuming that Republicans control the Senate, which is likely but not certain. It's also possible there will be areas of common interests. In addition, there are strategies that the Democrats might be able to use that could induce bipartisan cooperation. Then there are very important areas where legislative action would be required to accomplish the Biden's objectives and the Democrats' objectives, where Republican obstruction in the Senate is likely to be definitive, and those objectives will come up short. So then if there's a lot that's going to be hanging in the balance during much of the Biden administration, it's important to think about the prospects for the coming elections. And the first thing to be said is that the 2022 midterm elections almost always result in losses for the president's party. So there's a good chance that the Democrats would lose control of the House of Representatives. But it's also the case that there's rather good grounds for expecting major recovery of the country from COVID and from the economic recession during the course of the Biden administration. Biden might get a good deal of credit for that. And I think that there's some reason for the Biden people to be optimistic about winning re-election, either Biden himself or his successor, possibly Kamala Harris, in 2024. So those are the general observations I'll make, and I'll be happy to expand on whatever people are interested in.
Thank you very much, Paul. And now we'd like to turn to Gyung-Ho, who will be speaking to us for a few minutes with opening remarks about the congressional election.
Okay, all right. Let me share. Okay. Where's the share? Do you see my screen or?
Yes. I see it.
Okay, good. All right. Okay. I will talk about the what had happened in Congress. To give you a simple answer, the answer is not much. Okay. First of all, let me start with the outcomes of the election. I mean, we know that we have to wait until January 5th to know which party will be the majority in the Senate. The House, at this point, we know that Democrats will be the majority. But the question is the size of the majority. And it looks like, as of yesterday, Democratic majority will have only 4 votes to spare. So this is a really slim majority. And that actually creates a problem for the House, for the Biden, okay? Because he cannot take it for granted for the House, actually. With such a tight majority in the House, for them to pass any legislation in the House, they need almost all members a vote, okay? But what we see already within Democratic Party is that there's an internal division between the moderates and the progressives. Moderates, they are blaming the progressive agenda for their loss in this election. And progressives, they demand immediate actions on this agenda, okay? And the problem for the Democratic leadership is that, I mean, if they force these 2 different wings to vote in one direction, it will actually doom their chance in next election. Actually, in fact, the prospect for them in the next election is not so bright, okay? As Paul mentioned earlier, I mean, next election is midterm election, so the president party tend to lose. But the more serious problem for the Democrat is that in this election, actually Republicans actually gained their control over the state government, okay? So next year, what will happen is that about 30 states will be controlled by Republicans, and they will be drawing the House district maps, okay? And they will set the stage for the next 10 years of the House races, okay? I mean, to give you a sense of how serious this problem is for Democrats, I will show you the history of the partisan composition of state legislature since 1978, okay? So what we see here is that the number of states controlled by Democrats has been declining over the years. The number of states controlled by Republicans has been increasing, okay? So with this, we know that next 10 years, actually, there will be severe disadvantage for Democrats in the House elections. And because of that, actually, Democratic leadership will be really careful in pushing through this, the progressive agendas through the House, okay? I mean, if they do that, then they will expose vulnerable members to the election campaign attacks, okay? And there's one more reason for the House Democrats actually will be hesitating the pushing through all this progressive agenda is that they know that even if they pass these progressive bills in the House, they are most likely to die in the Senate. Okay, so there's a big risk of pushing this through the House. Okay, and if we go to the Senate, there's a serious problem. I mean, even when Democrats win both seats in Georgia, which is unlikely, Democrats actually they won't be able to eliminate the filibuster, and if they don't eliminate the filibuster, they are less likely to pass any progressive legislation, not even packing the Supreme Court. Okay, and last week, Joe Manchin actually made it clear that he is not going to vote for the eliminating the filibuster in the Senate. Okay, and some people say that this is kind of the strategic move to help the election campaign in Georgia, but Not necessarily. I think he meant it seriously because he is one of the 3 senators, Democratic senators, who voted against eliminating the filibuster for the executive appointment and non-Supreme Court or judicial appointment in 2013. Okay. So with that, there's no chance they will actually eliminate filibuster, and the chance of passing any progressive legislation through the Senate is actually gone. Okay. So for Biden, the chance of passing any progressive legislation through Congress is really, really small. But I mean, he can use some executive actions and the executive orders. But if any of them are really significant in the direction of the progressive agenda, they are likely to be challenged in the court. And the court is already most the conservative side. So what we can expect is not much change in the next 2 years or 4 years. But I think there's one area we will see big change, and that will be the federal bureaucracies, I think. Especially, I expect the expert and professionals actually will play more important role in the next 4 years, actually. During the Trump administration, what we saw was the attacks on these experts and professionals from the beginning of the FBI investigations, and more recently, the health experts being sidelined in their response to the pandemic. Okay, and last month, actually, the President Trump issued an executive order. They make it easier to fire some civil servants, actually. So all these add up to the attacks on the experts and professionals. But on the new administration, I expect that the experts and professionals will be brought back to play a significant role in federal bureaucracies. And since federal bureaucracy, actually federal government does a lot of things, the fact that the experts and professionals will be more significant players in federal bureaucracy, actually, that's the area we'll see a lot of changes, I think. So I want to end this initial comments with some positive notes. Okay. Okay, that's it.
Thank you very much, Gyung-Ho. Very interesting situation we have in front of us. I'd now like to turn to Kristen, who is going to be speaking to us with her opening remarks about global governance, international trade.
Great, thanks, Sheryl. So yeah, I'm going to shift gears to the international level and focus particularly on what the election means for trade and trade governance. As we know, Trump has really waged an assault on the rules-based multilateral trading system. This is a system that, for 70 years, the U.S. played the leading role in constructing a relatively open, liberal trading order based on the rule of law, based on multilateralism, and Trump has really sort of thrown a wrecking ball into that system. We've seen him impose tariffs on all of the U.S.'s major trading partners, launch trade wars, blatantly and repeatedly violate the rules of the World Trade Organization. He also blocked appointments to the WTO's appellate body, which effectively functions as a supreme court for global trade, and in doing so has thrown the entire system for peacefully resolving trade disputes among states into jeopardy. And of course, he's also threatened to withdraw from free trade agreements like NAFTA, forcing countries like Canada to renegotiate those agreements and give greater concessions to the US. So under Trump, we really saw the US weaponize trade, using it as an instrument of economic coercion. And the US has really been very much a rogue state in the multilateral trading system. So I think there's a widespread expectation that we'll see a significant shift in US trade policy under Biden. He has signaled that he's interested in recommitting to multilateralism, to international institutions like the WTO, and to the rule of law. And he's also indicated that he wants to reinvest in key US alliances. So this is potentially a significant change in the trading system. But at this point, Biden has been very short on specifics in terms of what he actually intends to do on trade. One of the big questions is whether he will unblock appointments to the WTO appellate body. This is a critical issue. The future of the rules-based trading system really hinges on the ability of its dispute settlement mechanism to function. And to do so, it needs an appellate body that's in operation. So this is a key question. We still don't know what Biden intends to do. Another key issue is the Section 232 tariffs that the US imposed on steel and aluminum, which affected countries around the world. Biden hasn't been entirely clear, but he seems to be signaling that he's in principle opposed to those tariffs, which were imposed on very dubious grounds of national security. So it looks likely that he will revoke those tariffs, which would be quite important. He's also been equally vague in terms of what he intends to do with regards to China and US trade policy directed at China. We know that the phase one trade agreement that was signed between the US and China under Trump is in trouble. There's no way that China is anywhere near on track to meet the commitments that it made in that agreement to dramatically increase its imports of US goods. It's only right now at about 50% of the promised increase. So those promises were likely unrealistic to begin with, and COVID has made them even more difficult to achieve. So this phase one agreement, which is what made it possible to sort of broker a ceasefire between the US and China in their trade war, is likely to fall apart, and it's not clear how Biden intends to handle that, how he'll deal with the phase one agreement. And it's not clear yet what he intends to do in terms of the Section 301 tariffs that the US imposed on China, launching its trade war with China, whether he'll revoke those tariffs, and if so, whether he'll do so purely in exchange for China also revoking the tariffs that it imposed in retaliation, or if he'll try to demand some kind of greater concessions from China, some sort of deeper changes in its trade policies in exchange for withdrawing US tariffs. So lots of questions. One thing that's clear is that Biden does share many of Trump's concerns about China's trading practices, things like heavy industrial subsidies, forced technology transfer, and intellectual property violations. So he has very similar concerns about China's supposedly unfair trade practices, but he has indicated that he intends to try to address those concerns through multilateral forums like the WTO and working in partnership with other allies. So I think we may see an increase in activity at the WTO, and particularly greater emphasis on the trilateral initiative, which has been launched in recent years, driven by Japan, the EU, and the US, to try to push for some kinds of reforms in WTO rules, specifically to address some of these trade policies of China that these countries find problematic. And one of the larger sort of the context for this is that it's very likely that in the next decade or so, we will see the size of the Chinese economy surpass that of the US. So in this broader context, if the US wants to try to have influence over China's trade or economic policies, or any other policies for that matter, now more than ever, it needs allies to try to do that. So one thing that we may see is renewed interest on the part of the US in rejoining the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is now the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. Just last weekend, we saw the conclusion of RCEP, the Regional Economic Partnership, which is a mega regional trade agreement in the Asia-Pacific region that's now become the world's largest trade agreement. And this is something that was very much a China-driven, China-led initiative, and it's seen as an effort to really increase China's influence in the region. So in an effort to counter that, we may see renewed impetus on the part of the US under Biden to rejoin the CPTPP in an effort to sort of try to counter China's growing influence in the region. And that's something that would be quite consequential for, particularly for Canada, as well as other participants in the CPTPP. But particularly for Canada, because the new NAFTA agreement that Canada was forced to negotiate with the USMCA, it broadly replicates many of the provisions of the old NAFTA. It doesn't depart very much from the old NAFTA, except one key way in which it does is that it effectively contains a ticking time bomb in the agreement. And this is a poison pill that was put into the agreement by the Trump administration that stipulates that the agreement will automatically expire after 16 years unless all three countries that are participants in the agreement agree to actually renew and extend the agreement. So the three participating countries are required to sit down every 6 years, review the USMCA, and agree to extend the agreement. And the issue for Canada, as well as Mexico, is what this means is that the US can potentially hold Canada and Mexico hostage and force them to renegotiate the agreement perpetually in order to extract greater concessions from both Canada and Mexico. So, see, people are having difficulty with the audio, so just put my mic a little closer and see if that helps. So the CPTPP in many ways replicates a lot of the provisions of the USMCA. So the issue for Canada is if the US were to rejoin the CPTPP, that would be extremely consequential in terms of ensuring security of our market access to the US and ensuring that we're able to maintain our current access to the US market, which of course is critical for long-term economic stability to promote investment and so forth. So I'll conclude there and look forward to digging into some of these issues more thoroughly in our Q&A session. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Kristen. Appreciate your comments. Rounding out the opening remarks, I'd now like to turn the mic over to Heidi, who is going to speak about COVID-19.
Thanks so much. So I just wanted to make 5 points around COVID-19 and the election. The first is to put this election into a broader international perspective. So obviously we've had several other elections during the pandemic, including in South Korea in April, which like the US election saw extremely high turnout, New Zealand, BC, et cetera, et cetera. In each one of those, the government that was currently in power at that time was actually re-elected, and in most cases with a much greater majority than it had before. So if we put this pandemic election in the US into that kind of international perspective, it's actually quite unusual in that the person who was in power at the time will be leaving. So that's the first thing to say. The second, I think, truly importantly to say about anything related to COVID is to remember that this election is happening amidst a terrible tragedy, a human tragedy that in the US also disproportionately affects some Americans more than others, particularly Black Americans and Native Americans. So Black Americans at this moment are dying at rates that are more than double the rates of death amongst white Americans. This, lays bare once again that the deep inequalities within American society, exacerbated economic inequalities, social inequalities, public health inequalities. And I think that always bears repeating and reminding that this isn't a tragedy that has affected everybody equally, and that has been exposed over and over again, not only in who is affected, but also in who is being looked after, mentioned, and discussed when we talk about COVID-19. Okay, last 3 points more about the politics and the election. One, I think, key feature of this election is that it was being run on extremely different issues depending on whether you were looking at the Biden campaign or the Trump campaign. The Biden campaign in many ways was running on COVID. They were making this an election in many ways about COVID and the Trump administration's handling of COVID. The Trump campaign in many ways was running an election on the economy and claiming that they could bring the economy back. They had had a great economy before COVID had come and derailed it. So in many ways, the two campaigns exemplified, I think, a problematic way in which many countries have been discussing COVID, which is to create a kind of false dichotomy between public health versus the economy. When in fact, what we know is that you cannot have an economic recovery without having COVID under control. And we can see that obviously when we look in international comparison, that countries that have really had growth of any kind are jurisdictions like Taiwan or South Korea that have actually gotten COVID under control. And in part, that's for the simple reason that certain types of demands simply aren't going to happen if people are scared to go to a restaurant or do certain group activities justifiably. So what we saw in the very campaign itself was this continual false dichotomy of it's public health or the economy. But what we see is there can be no full economic recovery or growth until you solve the COVID problem. We saw also, though, in many of the exit polls that this really had sort of resonated with certain voters. So for example, one exit poll that looked at Republican voters in Florida found that many of them were voting because they were thinking about the economy and COVID wasn't really top of mind, and that often for voters who were voting for the Democrats, COVID was top of mind. So I think it really helps us to understand that this election was really being run on completely different issues in many cases for these campaigns. Fourth point, the pandemic has obviously been politicized in a whole host of different ways in the US, but now we see that the transition to has been politicized in ways that are exacerbating the COVID crisis. The Biden transition team has said they're not getting access to various types of information, so that is going to mean the transition will be slightly lengthier and more problematic than it would have been otherwise. We still don't know exactly what effects that will have on, for example, the logistics of vaccines, or how quickly certain types of public health campaigns can be gotten off the ground. But what we can say for certain is that a transition of this kind is going to exacerbate the COVID crisis, which accelerates in horrifying ways and exponential ways if we look at the number of cases, and quite likely, as in Canada, Thanksgiving will only make that far worse as students return home and people potentially disregard public health guidelines and gather in person without masks. So this politicization of the transition, the lack of information, even if Biden has incredibly competent people around him, will exacerbate this crisis with potentially many, many thousands of deaths that could have been avoided. The final thing that I'll say is clearly for the Biden administration, COVID is top of mind. COVID is the #1 thing that they want to deal with and to address. And they have framed many other things that they are doing around that. And there's certainly an even broader case for public health reform. And this is something that public health epidemiologists and experts were bringing up even under the Obama administration as well, because if we look at actual spending on public health on the ground in the United States, it has been continually going down over the last couple of decades, regardless of which people are in power within a whole host of Democratic and Republican states. However, there are also specific things done within the Obama administration that the Trump administration then reversed, which Biden might bring back. The one that's probably best known to all of you is that there used to be a seat for global health pandemic portfolio within the National Security Council that was created by the Obama administration after Ebola, and that was removed by the Trump administration in 2018. That's a sort of obvious public health reform. Perhaps there will be greater attention to what it means to have public health rather than the continual focus on individual health, which comes through things like the Affordable Care Act. And the final aspect of public health reform, which Biden has already made clear, is rejoining the WHO. And we'll have to see exactly what that means, whether that will just mean simply rejoining or thinking about reforming or creating greater resources, because the World Health Organization, in its current financing, to give you a sense of how little resources the WHO has, its budget is basically 1/6 of the public health budget of the state of Maryland. So if the Biden administration wants to do public health reform, there's a lot of resources that could quite easily be put into that. I'll finish there and look forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Heidi. And how we will plan to proceed now is I have a handful of questions to ask the panel members, either individually or in small groups. And then after that, we will proceed with time for audience questions. So I'd just like to turn first to Paul for a domestic comment, and then hopefully Kristen as well for a global comment. And I see you've changed headsets, so I hope that our sound quality is better for you this time, Kristen. And apologies for those who had trouble hearing Kristen. My question is about a phenomenon we've seen in the last couple of weeks, hollowing out of the bureaucracy by the Trump administration during what I think we could say is a quite fragile period that we've been in the last couple of weeks. And in some sense, there's a bit of a firing spree that's been going on. And the motives for these firings have not always been particularly clear, whether they're meant to pursue some sort of policy goal or to punish someone for perceived disloyalty. And we also have seen the Trump administration appointing others. For example, Michael Ellis as general counsel of the National Security, the NSA, and making him a civilian member of the senior executive service. So how will these last minute dismissals and changes to personnel, do you think, impact the new administration upon their entry? And I'd like to turn to Paul first, like I said, for a comment on the domestic circles, and then hopefully Kristen can add some comment from a global perspective. Thank you, Paul.
Okay, you have me back. Thanks. That's a very interesting question. I am unmuted now. Is that correct?
Yep, we can hear you. Yep.
Okay. There are really two things that you talked about. One was the hollowing out of the bureaucracy, which I think is kind of a reference to Trump's orientation toward the bureaucracy, especially liberal or scientific bureaucracies over the whole course of his administration. And the second is some very unusual firings and replacements at top levels of the administration, especially in national security in recent times. And these are different matters. The first thing to say is that hundreds of important scientists and experts have left the federal government during the Trump administration. Hundreds, actually, of scientists just from the EPA alone. And that has also large numbers from the Centers for Disease Control and lots of other places. The Biden administration will go about trying to replace those and rebuild that capacity, but that takes a long time. You know, people work a whole career developing expertise in a government agency with people with scientific and expert training. And it takes a long time to replace them. So there is going to be a dramatic change in attitude and toward those bureaucracies by the Biden administration, and some recovery. It'll also be the case that the remaining scientific expertise that's there will be more influential instantly. So those will be constructive changes. On these replacements in the national security bureaucracy, there's been a fair amount of speculative discussion of what they mean. And what seems to be the leading interpretation is twofold. One is that the most important is that Trump is just trying to take revenge against people who offended him, that didn't obey, weren't sycophantic enough, or didn't cooperate with some of his schemes to try to undermine the election or undermine Democrats. And so it's just punishment. And in a way, it's not very important because these are people who would only hold the office for another month and a half anyway. There are also some thoughts about what is he trying to do. You know, does he have plans to conduct military operations or to try to take over the government or whatever with these national security appointments? What I think is the most likely, what I think is the best interpretation of the substantive objectives that he may have, that is apart from just exacting revenge, is that he is trying to promote people in the national security bureaucracy who may try to bolster his claims about a bogus Russian-related investigation of him during his presidency. People who might cooperate in trying to find documents that support his portrayal of those events. There isn't any evidence, I don't think, that he's going to be trying to find military leaders who would help him maintain power by force. And it's very clear that the military itself in the United States, it understands its relation to civil affairs, the need for constitutional processes, and in fact is highly skeptical of Trump.
Thank you, Paul. I'd like to give Kristen an opportunity to offer some thoughts on the global level.
Sure. So on the global level, I mean, one thing that we saw over the course of the Trump administration was a real exodus of people from the U.S. State Department. People left in droves. And so that was a big loss of human capital that it will be difficult to rebuild. Another issue, though, in addition to that, is the US is somewhat unique or distinct in how long it takes to get senior appointments made when there's a new administration that comes into power. Many key appointments are political appointments and they require Senate confirmation, and there can be a huge lag, especially as you're sort of working your way down the layers of government to get key people in place in key positions. And that's often an issue with foreign policy and trade in particular. So the US trade representative may take 6 months to a year to actually have a new US trade representative, effectively the US's chief negotiator, in place. And that makes it incredibly difficult for the US to have a real trade policy that it's implementing. And what often happens with US elections is the world sort of finds itself in stasis, waiting for the US to appoint these key people and actually be able to formulate a policy that it will then implement. And one of the issues right now is we have at the WTO, there's a real push to try to secure specifically an international agreement on fishery subsidies, which is an objective set out in the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which gave states a deadline to try to reach an agreement by the end of this year, which likely won't be met. So pushing the agreement to try to conclude something by a ministerial meeting next June. But the issue is if we don't have a USTR in place and we don't have a real US trade policy in operation, without the US playing a significant role in those negotiations, it's unlikely that we'll be able to see a conclusion there. And that's a really critical issue for the trading system and also for global environment and global development as well. And similarly, the UK and the US are rushing to try to conclude a trade agreement now, sort of a post-Brexit key trade agreement for the UK. But there too, US Fast Track Authority will expire in July. And in order to actually get any agreement through Congress in time before Fast Track expires, they would need to reach an agreement by April, which will be extremely difficult to do without a new USTR and a team there in place. So the whole, the lag and the long process involved in these appointments in the US can be quite a challenge for trade policy and foreign policy as well.
Thanks so much, Kristen and Paul. I have a question, if I could go to Heidi next. I appreciate your 5 points, and I'm hoping we can spend a little time talking more about the political polarization that's gone on pertaining to COVID. And I'm also sensitive to the mention you made that without the transition formally in place, that the Biden administration coming in has hands a bit tied in terms of rolling out strategies or plans for, say, vaccine distribution, national testing, or even a communication strategy to try to deal with some of this polarization. Do you have any thoughts about what they can do in the interim until, or unless and until they get a green light on transition?
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question. So they've already been doing a huge amount, right? So the first basically thing that Biden announced after his victory party on that Saturday was on the Monday to then announce a 13-member coronavirus task force. So they're already doing actually quite a lot, including messaging, right? So if you look at Biden's speeches and everything he's doing now, messaging simply by wearing a mask and asking people to wear a mask, telling them that it's not political, and having this 13-member team in place. And obviously epidemiologists and specialists can argue about who should be on that team, what are the disciplines that actually probably should be represented that aren't, but regardless, there is a team of people in place, many of whom have worked within government, who are already trying to formulate strategies. So there's actually a great deal that he's already trying to do, even as he is hamstrung in some of the ways that I already described. The other thing that he's done is make a clear statement by making his chief of staff, Ron Klain, who he's worked with for a long time, but who also was heading up the Ebola response. So the way that he's trying to deal with this, or the team is clearly trying to deal with this, is to bring in a lot of people who have experience of dealing with public health crises and pandemics within the US government. So as far as possible, can hit the ground running. But what exactly you will see when you get there is obviously quite hidden to them, which is somewhat problematic. But those are the things that they're already trying to do, trying to get a message out there of wearing masks and so on and so forth as quickly as possible. And maybe the other thing that I would say, because I think it is important to say, is that it's not such a neat division actually in terms of which states are doing well. So one of the things that the Trump administration did, right, is leave so much of this up to the states to deal with, which caused all sorts of problems with coordination, procurement, and so on and so forth. But there isn't necessarily a clear division that, you know, Democratic or Republican states are doing better or worse at different times. You know, we are seeing an uptick throughout the United States, in part because of that lack of coordination, but also states like New York really struggling with this phase and trying to decide the sort of values behind what you close, how you stop the virus from spreading further. So while perhaps some of the Republican governors like Kristi Noem of South Dakota have been much more vocal in rejecting things like mask mandates, states are struggling regardless of whether they're Democratic or Republican. So I hope that if there can be more coordination between states and Biden can do some of that, maybe already we can see some changes. So there's a lot that can be done, but of course, if there were the ability to sort of see inside, for example, vaccine logistics, you might be able to roll it out faster in 2021.
Thanks so much, Heidi. I'd like to turn to Gyung-Ho now, and I have a particular question about Congress and representation in Congress. And I'm going to ask you questions that are maybe a bit out of your specialization, but are very near and dear to my own heart, which is the Native American story with Congress this term. So what we noticed, and some of these results were a bit late to roll out because of the delayed vote counting in particular states, but with the impact of this high turnout and the fact that margins were very slim in some cases, the Native American vote in the US saw some outcomes that were in some cases extremely significant and notable, although I said it's a slower story. It didn't come out the night of the election, but it became more and more clear as we moved into the following weekend. And the Native American vote had a significant impact in races in Congress and also in the presidency in Arizona, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Nevada, at least. And we saw this time a record number of Native candidates for Congress. 14 in total ran for the US House and the Senate. And there were re-elections of the two existing seats that Native women held, both in Kansas and in New Mexico for Democrats. And one of those now, her name has been circulating as a very serious contender for the Department of the Interior. And she would be the first Native American holding that position if she were named, which is very important because the Bureau of Indian Affairs lies, of course, within the Department of Interior. And then a few other candidates in Oklahoma won their re-election. Native Hawaiian won his. So all in all, we are sending this time 6 Native Americans or Native Hawaiians to Congress, which is a record. But I also note when we do the math, that's that population proportion would actually be 11 members. So there's still a gap of almost 50% in what would be proportional representation. So just thinking of that, I wonder if you have some comments and insights about proportionality issues such as this, and how, as a country in an electoral system, we could begin to address some discrepancies like that, where even with record turnouts, we're still barely reaching half of what would be proportion. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts that you could share.
I think you know more about that than I do, but I guess, I mean, one of the issue here is I guess the districting. I mean, in the House elections, it's usually politicians, like state government. They control how to draw the electoral maps at the beginning of every decade. So, I mean, in 2010, that's one of the years where Republicans made significant advance in state government. Actually, even more serious than the 2020 this election. Actually, so although Democrats, they gained back in 2018, the House election, but it took almost 8 years to kind of correct what they did in 2010. So I don't know if this is answering to your question or not, but it comes down to the Constitution, where it's left to the state governments to draw the district maps, and which party control the state government actually eventually will drive the outcomes of the House elections for next 10 years. So I think, and on that, this election also doesn't help to solve this issue of proportionality, especially in the House, because now we have 30 state governments controlled by Republicans. So does that answer to your question? Or I mean, it's almost the Senate, the same thing. In Senate, I mean, the conservatives or rural interests, they are more represented because of the Constitution says that every state gets to have 2 senators. The same thing in the House, it's the state government who control the state government. Okay, so hopefully that answers some of your question.
Thanks so much, Gyung-Ho. I have one more question to direct, and I'm going to put Kristen on the spot for it. And then I'd like to open up for audience questions. So just a reminder, you'll notice in the chat that you can send audience questions to Catalina and then indicate to her whether you would like to ask the question yourself, which would be recorded, or she can ask it for you and you can remain anonymous or just named by first name in the recording. So we see some questions coming in, but I invite more questions to come forward, again, sent to Catalina. So Kristen, I'm wondering, you mentioned multilateralism and that we could expect to see a return to a more multilateral approach with this administration. And I do agree with that. And I'm going to play devil's advocate a bit for you, just so that we can have a richer discussion. And also because this is, and when we think in terms of anti-colonialism or decolonization, the question of multilateral approaches becomes quite salient. So it is on my mind. And I'm thinking here about a recent article about that was talking about the Haitian diaspora in Florida, and argued that while Haitian Americans and many other immigrant groups have historically voted Democratic, sometimes we see an interesting counterintuitive, like we have seen in this election, where some younger Haitian Americans and maybe new immigrants were actually supporting Donald Trump, and partially, as they voiced in this article, and I've heard this in other sectors too, he is less likely to care about and meddle in issues back home. So the idea that it was a non-multilateral approach or a non-interventionist stance by the United States for the past 4 years was actually welcomed by some as a positive step. Again, it's a counterintuitive, but it is one of the things that we have observed. And so I'm hoping that you could offer us a bit of comment. So what would this mean for decolonization efforts or anti-imperial efforts, and I guess particularly anti-US imperialism or neo-imperialism around the world? And hoping you could just give us some thoughts on that.
Don't know if Kristen heard that.
Okay, I was hoping Kristen could take it, but Paul, maybe you have some thoughts?
I'm not an expert in foreign policy, but international relations. But I do have a point that I think is important about the resumption of multilateralism. I won't be able to focus it on questions of decolonization or issues related to that. And that is that I think that that American allies and international organizations will welcome the United States back with open arms, but not trust the United States in the way that they had in the past. Because whatever Joe Biden's attitude is toward multilateralism, and it's what you'd expect as of a traditional Democrat on foreign policy, and actually reflects what had been before Trump, essentially the consensus bipartisan strategy of the United States. However much committed to it he is, it's apparent that the United States has the potential to abandon it again. And that's really important when it comes to establishing effective international organizations and international cooperation. The countries that you would like to cooperate with you, in some cases, have serious conflicts to deal with and serious alternatives, like instead dealing with our rivals, working with China or even working with Russia. And the fact that the United States cannot be counted on, indefinitely to maintain the same multilateral orientation and commitment to our alliances, I think is going to be a major weakening force. So this would pertain to just about any subject, but including the one that you raised.
Thank you, Paul. And it looks like we lost Kristen. So hopefully we could re-ask that when she comes back. Heidi, would you like to take that question for a moment?
Yeah, just briefly, putting my historian hat on, I think we should be really careful in seeing the Trump administration leaving international organizations as some sort of aberration, because in fact, if we look at the history of UN organizations, we see the US has, for example, left UNESCO twice. And in both cases, that directly pertains to what you're raising, Sheryl. So in the first instance, leaving along with the UK over some pushes by other countries to try to create a more decolonized media and news strategy to create what was known as the New World International and Communication Order that was trying to push back against what many countries saw as the Anglo-American dominance of news. The US and the UK both left UNESCO over that for over a decade. And subsequently in the early 2010s, the US left UNESCO again after UNESCO admitted Palestine. So I think we should be wary of seeing these moves by the Trump administration, for example, to leave the WHO as something unique and unprecedented. It isn't. Now, leaving the UN as a whole would have been, but even US fights about funding the UN also go back quite a few decades. Skepticism about the role of international organizations, the desire to only hear voices from some nations and some peoples and not others. This goes back to the very founding of the United Nations. So I guess I would see this in a broader historical perspective as something not completely unprecedented, to choose to leave certain agencies and to use that for political gains, often in reaction to calls by other nations to have a greater say. So perhaps this can be a moment actually to really think about who deserves a say in international organizations, how they should function, and whether the United States should in fact have such a large voice in some of those places.
I appreciate that, Heidi, and thanks for jumping in. When I look at the history of U.S. policy, I also see a lot of gyrations about international engagement or what the role of the U.S. Could or should be. And I see we have Kristen, whose computer has cooperated with her again. So Kristen, we're still on the same question, but Paul and Heidi offered some thoughts. So I'd like to give you the chance to take the mic.
Did she hear it?
I did hear it, but unfortunately, I didn't hear your original question. I got kicked out right in the middle of it. Sorry about that. Yeah.
Okay, it was a long question, and it was about U.S. engagement overseas, and that sometimes, and we see it particularly in some of the immigrant communities, counterintuitively, some of the immigrant communities were favoring the Trump anti-interventionist approach or anti-multilateral approach because he's less likely to meddle in affairs back home. And what sort of impacts does this have as we think ahead towards a multilateral approach, keeping a decolonial or anti-imperial lens in mind?
Well, I would say Trump wasn't purely isolationist. He also used economic tools as weapons to intervene in the affairs of other states. So we saw this with Mexico, for example, when he used the threat of imposing tariffs and cutting off Mexico's access to the US market as a way to try to put pressure on Mexico to take measures to block Central American immigrants flowing through Mexico to the US. So I don't think he was actually so isolationist and anti-interventionist. I think he was intervening in the affairs of other states in really significant ways, just doing so perhaps with other tools and in other ways than other states. So ideally, it would be great if we could have a stronger multilateral system that would constrain the behavior of powerful states like the US and prevent the sort of weaponization of trade and other economic instruments, and sort of rein in these powerful states and ensure that, things are governed by the rule of law and not just, economic coercion and the raw use of power as we've seen under the Trump administration.
Thanks for that, and it's good to have you back. I'm going to turn over to Catalina now to take audience Q&A.
All right, thank you so much, Sheryl. I'd like to start by thanking all of the panelists for participating with us today and giving so many useful insight, and for Sheryl as well for asking so many great questions. We have a lot of audience questions, so I'm going to try to get through them and maybe combine some of them as we go so that we can get through as many of them as possible. So the first question is actually linked to what we were talking about in terms of foreign relations and intervention. And people are wondering what you guys see as the implications of this election and of the Biden administration having on the US role in international relations, specifically in two areas, one in terms of peace in the Middle East, and also in terms of how the new government is going to address the growing populist sentiments against governments, not just in the US, but across the world. So it wasn't directed at anyone specifically, so perhaps, Paul, you can start us off and anyone can chime in after that.
Let me suggest that Gyung-Ho actually I happen to know, pays more attention to the politics of foreign policy in the United States than I do. And I think that the part of the question about the effect of the election on Americans' role in the Middle East is probably the more easily addressed of those. But Gyung-Ho, is that correct?
I can say something about the the Congress. But I think that in terms of the President Biden, assuming that he will do the same thing or similar approach to the foreign policy as the Obama presidency, I think one issue that he will do is to deal with the Iran. Maybe he wants to bring back this nuclear deal with Iran because Trump actually and the Republicans, they actually ditched that. So that might be one thing, but my assumption here is that it'll be tough to pass in Congress. Republicans, they're not going to like to make another deal with Iran. So, but it's my guess. The President Biden will try to make some kind of deal with Iran, but it'll be tough, I guess. Yeah, and yeah, and in terms of generally, in general, the Democrats, they prefer the multilateral approach. So, they will try to make the close relationship with allies like NATO or Japan, things like that. So, the approach will be totally different. I think they will focus more on the building on the multilateral relationship with other countries. So. Yeah. If there's any specific question, I don't know, but it's kind of the general approach of the Democratic president on foreign policy. Maybe somebody else can answer more questions.
Yes, would anyone else like to chime in on that question before we move on?
Might just jump in on the second part of the question about sort of the growing wave of populist movements and authoritarian governments globally. And I think there was a strong sense that Trump sort of legitimated that rise and helped to legitimate, the Bolsonaros in Brazil and the Modis in India and even Xi Jinping in China. And so I think there was a hope that a really striking repudiation of Trump in this election would help to shift the tide. And since we haven't seen that, there hasn't been that sort of whole-scale move against this, and that's may help to continue that legitimation of these other governments elsewhere.
All right, thank you. A question that is also a bit of a follow-up in terms of international relations, but this focused more on trade. So perhaps, Kristen, you can take a first stab at this. We have a question from Brent here that says, the trade policy community is almost universal in its hope that Biden will sign on to the CPTPP. So how politically feasible is this, in your opinion, and how are they going to gain support from the Rust Belt states?
That's a great question. So I think there's a lot of support for Biden to potentially sign on to CPTPP, and I think this is an area where he could get support from Republicans. The issue is with the Democrats and the sort of concerns from the left and the progressive side about trade agreements. And one of the issues is that CPTPP has actually managed to avoid some of the worst aspects of the US's typical trade agreements. So when the US withdrew from TPP, the countries that went ahead with CPTPP got rid of, for example, the very stringent intellectual property protections that the US had aggressively pushed for in that agreement. So from a progressive perspective, CPTPP is actually a much better agreement than TPP was. So it may be that that makes it more feasible to get congressional support for CPTPP, including from Democrats, particularly if Biden tried to negotiate side letters to address other concerns of the US, such as labor and environment, the way that the US did in the USMCA. So I think it will be definitely not easy by any means, but there is a potential path for trying to get US approval to rejoin CPTPP.
All right, thank you. If nobody else wants to jump in on that question, we can move on to other questions relating more towards the Congress and the ability for the Biden administration to push forward policy. So perhaps Gyung-Ho can take the lead on this one. So we have a question here saying that although it may be easier for Biden to make changes via executive action, should the administration consider the fact that these changes can more easily be overturned in the following presidency? And should this be weighed against the probability of being able to pass similar action through Congress, since the Congress is at this point so divided?
Can you repeat the question? I mean, in the middle?
Sure. I was just saying that, would it be better for the Biden administration to try to push forward legislation through executive action, which would be easily overturned in the following presidency if there was a Republican president to follow? Would this be better than trying to push forward legislation through Congress, considering that the Congress is so divided at the moment?
Oh, I mean, okay. I mean, either way, I mean, he will have a difficulty in making a major policy changes. I mean, passing legislation through Congress, if it is really ideologically charged, like a Voting Rights Act or a new Green Deal or the police reform, these are the really will have tough time to pass even the House, I think. So, I mean, he can use the executive actions or executive orders, but again, I mean, as I said earlier, I mean, they also can be challenged in the court. And the problem with going to the court is that during the Trump administration, there were numerous appointments by the conservatives. So I don't think it's wise. I mean, they can try, but it will be eventually reversed. So I don't see any easy way for President Biden to make major changes, either through the Congress or by bypassing the Congress.
Let me comment on that also. I think I disagree with what Gyung-Ho is saying in this case. A great deal of the distinctive policy actions that Trump is associated with were administrative actions. Some of them were executive orders, and some of them were administrative actions carried out by his administration in the agencies or by officials responsive to him. And they do not have statutory, there are no statutory constraints. I'm sorry, these were largely reversals or changes upon the policies that had existed prior to him, including repealing many regulations that were adopted during the Obama administration. A frequent feature of Trump's administrative actions was that they were themselves quite dubious in terms of administrative law. In many cases, the administration didn't carry out the procedures involving hearings and documentation that were required by administrative law, and many of them would have been subject to judicial challenge themselves. I think that the Biden administration is likely to be successful in reversing most of the extreme administrative changes and executive orders that the Trump administration introduced. Trump has appointed about 30% of the, actually it's about 30% of the Court of Appeals judges. That's the middle level of the federal government, and then he's appointed 1/3 of the Supreme Court. So I think you could exaggerate the extent to which the courts are kind of locked in as defenders of his approach. But in any case, if the question is whether to use administrative methods or to push for legislation, I think what Gyung-Ho said earlier stands, and that is that the legislative approach to these changes is basically a non-starter. That is, it will be blocked in the Senate for sure. So I'm more optimistic about what Biden could do administratively, but I do think that whatever that is all that can be done with any likelihood.
Thank you. I'd like to ask a follow-up question on that from Jerry, actually, who has pointed out the fact that Biden has hinted at his plans to be a one-term president. So do you think that this is going to diminish his power right out of the gate? And do you think the conversation is going to center more around who is going to run in 2024? And is that going to dominate this term more so than any other plans?
Let me claim that, since I write some about presidential elections. That's a really quite an interesting point. So Biden, I think, is 77 at this point, and he will be. That's pretty old, and he will be 4 years older. If he's reelected for another term, I think it's fair to say that there are signs of aging in his, in his demeanor and his and in his speech. They're not dramatic, however. I think he would. I think there would be some aspect of that is loss of personal power if he were to declare early that he isn't going to run for re-election again. I'm not sure how important that is, because there might be some skepticism about whether he's running again, whether he declares it or not. And a key thing, I think, will be what kind of a team he manages to form with Kamala Harris as vice president. In recent presidencies, the Trump case is an exception, I think. Vice presidents have had quite an important role in policy making and have worked very closely with the president. So Kamala Harris, I think, is going to be kind of the front runner automatically, not by any means someone who has the nomination locked up, but she will be seen as a very likely high-level competitor at a minimum for the nomination. So if Biden and Harris have a very close working relationship, and Biden loses some expectation of his future power, but it gets transferred to his close partner, Harris. That would mean that as a team, they will kind of maintain the same degree of power. So I don't think there's a big cost for them of the likelihood of Biden leaving.
All right, thank you. Would anyone else like to weigh in? If not, we can move on to what will likely be our last question given the time. So this again is open to any of the panelists. In terms of international relations, do you think that the US will once again move towards monitoring the protection of human rights? And how do you think this is going to affect US relationships, in particular economic relationships with countries like China or Saudi Arabia or the UAE?
I guess, I mean, I can take a shot at that. I mean, one thing we know about the Democrats is that they care more about human rights issues than the Republicans. So for sure, when they approach like issues like Saudi Arabia, or it could be North Korea and China, I mean, the human rights issue will be one of the top issues they will consider for sure. So it will actually make it more difficult for the Biden administration to deal with these countries, I think. So for example, Trump can ignore the human rights issue in the North Korea and then make a deal, or try to make a deal with North Korea. But for Biden, that's not going to be easy. Because within the party, there will be some pointing out that we don't want to make a deal with the those who violate human rights issues. So that'll be more tough for the Biden administration, I think.
I would just add on the China issue. The Trump administration did draw attention to human rights violations in China, but did so in a really damaging way, I think a very politicized way as part of its trade war and its broader sort of new Cold War with China. Saw, for example, the sanctions related to Xinjiang tied up in sort of a broader set of US economic measures. And I think the problem with that is that it's really damaged US credibility even further as sort of a champion of human rights on the global stage, or vis-a-vis China specifically. So I think, you know, Biden is likely to be more concerned about human rights, but the US reputation has been so tainted by Trump that he'll have difficulty having any sort of moral credibility on these issues at the international level.
Thank you. And if none of the other panelists would like to weigh in, I think that we might have time for then one more question. It goes back a little bit to what we were talking about in the Congress, but someone is wondering, Gyung-Ho, you mentioned that usually the party in power loses seats in the Congress when the second round of the midterm elections comes around, and we were wondering if you could go a little bit further into why that is.
Simply, usually it's the referendum on the incumbent president. Okay, and another issue is that, or the lack of the presidential quota. I mean, every 4 years we have presidential election and congressional election. So the candidate for the presidency can actually motivate the people to vote. But in midterm election, we don't have that kind of incentive. So the lack of presidential quota is one thing, and the other thing is usually the opposition party will try to use the election as kind of referendum on the incumbent president. So I think that's the two reasons why usually the president party loses in the midterm elections.
Let me add to that, if I can, that it's not just a referendum, it's not just a referendum, because in that, if it were that, then there'd be a decent chance for the president to be thought to be doing well, and for his party or her party to do well in the midterm elections. This tendency is almost completely uniform. I think there has been one election in the past 50 or 60 years in which the president's party gained seats in the midterm election. I'm not sure of the number, but it's a very small number. And so what I think is going on in part is that people just kind of get tired of that party being in power, or something like that that is more automatic. So there's quite a bit of a barrier to overcoming that. Now, I do think it's an important possibility that the pandemic may be solved, over the next couple of years if the vaccine is really important. That's probably an exaggeration, but if the pandemic is much less of a threat and the economy is coming back, it could be one of those rare times where the party in control of the presidency actually gains seats in the midterm election. I wouldn't completely rule it out, but it is rare.
All right, thank you. With that, I think we unfortunately have to conclude our audience Q&A portion, so I'll hand it over to Jerry for closing remarks.
Thanks, Catalina, and thanks for managing that Q&A. And thanks to our panelists today, and to Sheryl for moderating this session. Thank you all for joining us. If this is the first time you did, or if you've been with us for the whole series, it's been really great. Thank you to all the people who have helped put it together at the School of Public Policy, the Political Science Department, and helpers all among those different places where we've had tremendous support and tremendous help to bring these sessions to you. And also, if you are interested in older sessions, point you to the the website for Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions, where we've archived the previous sessions, and where this one will also be archived, so you'll be able to watch those older sessions where we had the different topics. I know some of it's aged because things continue moving quite quickly, but certainly there's lots of valuable insights from our past sessions that I invite you to go and look at. So thanks to everyone. Thanks to Rebecca. Thanks to Catalina, Tina, and all the folks at SPPGA, and thank you all for joining us. Thanks again, and well wishes to everyone, and hopefully the actual resolution of this election happens before we get to the new year. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.